Venom computers. This is Intelligent Performance.
Wendy Alexander, welcome to the Intelligent Performance Podcast. An absolute pleasure to have you with us. And today is all about diving deep into the world of career hacking. How do you land the dream job? What does it take to kind of navigate the interview process? One I've found particularly intimidating. So Wendy, I'm hoping you can help me kind of, the people listening to this and even myself, to kind of dispel a lot of the kind of the fear or anxiety, which I think job hunting can kind of invoke, and particularly if you're going for a dream role. So first of all, Wendy, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us, and you've got a very extensive background in corporate. So yeah, very much looking forward to diving into this conversation today.
Thanks, Michael. It's wonderful to be here. I'm looking forward to seeing how I can share the knowledge with your people.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that knowledge for just as a kickoff. So tell me, Wendy, your background. So you've worked, if you look at your LinkedIn, like a shopping list of some of the biggest corporates in Australia, and even some of the big global names like Bain are on there as well. So just give us a synopsis about, your career to date. What did you see, which kind of led you to this piece around developing Happy Career Hub and now helping people kind of navigate the job kind of, what do we call it, procurement process almost, or the job getting process?
Yeah, okay. So, I started out, from desperate times, challenged personally with a relationship breakup. And really the driving factor at the time, which is 26 years ago, was I need to make more money. That was it. I was pregnant, relationship ended, lost the house, all of this type of thing. And so in my head, it says, I need to make more money. And so I didn't really know where to start. But, I'm a follower of people like Tony Robbins, Wayne Dyer, all these people, all of my life. And, they all suggest that you find a mentor or someone who's been there or someone who has that knowledge, and you go and have conversations with those people. So what I want to say, first of all, is that it was incredibly uncomfortable to do that because by nature, I'm a writer. So I've always loved words. I'm a wordsmith, still working on a novel that I've been working on for 10 years. I never really thought that my writing could be used in sort of business context ways. So I did a lot of these things as hobbies, but I realized that I had a way with words. And so I started writing and rewriting my resume. But I also realized that I didn't understand or know the process of presenting myself to be able to land some of these interviews. And because in my mind, the figure that I wanted was $20,000 more a year. And so I started having these conversations, and it was very uncomfortable because a writer is by nature an introvert. We like to be in our little office with our little computer and our little pen and paper. That's the nature of the person. But, desperate times, desperate measures. I was like, I've got to do something. And so I went out there and started to talk to the people that I knew could advise me on how to get where I needed to go. And then I started to implement some of their strategies. So back then people were saying, sometimes people have resumes that are too long. And that's still the case now. A lot of people focus on their tasks and responsibility, but they never actually tell people the value that they can bring. And value is demonstrated by your achievements. So what people want to see, what hiring people want to see is, how can you contribute to my company? How can you contribute to my project? And your list of tasks and responsibilities doesn't tell them that. It's your achievements that tell them that. And so I started to rewrite my resume to focus on what I'd achieved in my leadership roles or any of the roles I'd held beforehand, and then started to land the interviews. Now, I didn't get the first one. It took me about 8 months to get that process knotted down. I was testing the market. I kept sending it out, going through the rejection and the frustration that a lot of people go through. But eventually I landed an interview, didn't get that first one, but landed a second interview. So here's another lesson. Don't give up, right? If you get the rejection, it's okay to feel a little bit deflated for a moment. I call it doona diving. right? I go under the doona and I dive under the doona, and I feel sorry for myself for a little while. And I think everybody does that when we're rejected or we're going through difficult times. But don't stay under the doona, is my message.
I think it's a useful one, because I've done a dive personally, and it makes you feel there's a kind of limited benefit in the short term. It certainly doesn't change the prognosis long term. So in terms of this podcast, so we focus here around intelligent performance, and it's about finding counterintuitive thinking around different topic areas. As many listeners will know to this, Venom is the sponsor, and this show is on behalf of Venom Computers, and their whole design philosophy is around intelligent performance. So I'm curious for you, if I had to ask you to define intelligent performance when it comes to applying for jobs, what kind of definition comes to you or comes to mind for you, Wendy?
Okay, so the first thing you need to do is you need to know your own professional story very well, which a lot of people don't. And I've been the one that's interviewed for jobs in the earlier years, but I've also ran project management offices in all of those big companies that you mentioned. And so I have been sitting on the other side of the table interviewing loads and loads of candidates, because I had to stand up big transformational programs, right? So you had to find the right people, the right developers, the right business analysts, the right testers, all of these that make up a huge transformational program. And what I found often was people would sometimes land the interview because they had a decent resume. Not all of it was very achievements focused, but they had enough in there to land the interview. But then they didn't understand their contribution in the previous roles. So they kept trying to regurgitate to me as the interviewer what the role should be or what they had done. Now, as a project leader or as a PMO manager, I'm looking for, but what did you do? What did you actually achieve in those roles that I can then go, okay, this person can bring that to our project as well. For example, and what I mean by an achievement is, here's a simple one. You could be a manager and you come onto a project and the project is struggling, right? And you notice the team that's delivering this project is not performing that well. So you can say in your resume that you came onto, so the framework that is currently the popular framework, because there's always a framework. There's the STAR framework. There's the SAO framework. At the moment, it's the CAR framework. And the CAR framework is all about articulating the challenge, the actions you took, and the results, right? So that's, remember CAR, challenge, I entered the project, flailing project team. What did I do? I took these couple of actions. I introduced one-to-one meetings. I introduced performance measures to help upskill our people. I introduced team bonding exercises. What was the result? The productivity rose by. Now, here's where you want to add some numbers and data and metrics, which a lot of people forget, right? Is productivity increased by 30%, 25%, whatever that percentage was. Because the moment you write it like that, the person reading it or the person listening to it, if you're articulating it in an interview, immediately understands the context. Here was the challenge you walked on. These are the 2 to 3 steps you took, and here was the result. And you can write that in a very short sentence. So it's also about writing very succinctly. Because one of the things, and I suppose here we're getting into some counterintuitive, people think that if they produce a resume or they articulating in an interview, if they overkill with information, that's going to get them the job or that's going to give them opportunity. But hiring people, recruiters are very busy people. You need to be able to articulate very quickly and very succinctly why your value is important.
Yeah.
And if you go on, what you're doing is you're showing that you lack awareness in the busyness of their time. Also, in the current market, hundreds of people are applying for one role. We get sometimes 100, 150, 200. I've seen 200 applications for one job.
Yeah.
So if you're not showing that awareness of the hiring person, you're already someone that's not standing out, right? The person who can succinctly tell a hiring person, here's why I can bring my value to your company, number one on the resume and on their LinkedIn profile, and then number two when they actually then interview. It's about being sharp and succinct and being able to sell your value in a very sharp and succinct way.
Well,
You're going to do yourself a lot of favors.
There's an interesting part, but even before that, I'd be curious to hear. So you mentioned before we jumped on that you typically work with kind of mid-career women, particularly they may be going through that kind of menopausal cycle, maybe pre, post, whatever you want to call it. But there's also a piece where at least the people I've come across is that you mentioned owning your professional story. I think it's an interesting way to look at it. There's also that kind of like the self-worth piece, right? Because if you've been in a toxic environment or if you've come through, forgive me, I don't want to imply this was the case for yourself, but like a tough relationship, for example, then you might not exactly be feeling super chipper about yourself, right? So how do you kind of advise people to repair? Because that's maybe why they're even trying to like so motivated to progress, to go after their dream job, or even just go after what they think they might be worth. So how do you kind of focus on that bit where you're kind of almost resuscitating someone from their self-belief?
So so first of all, I want to say right off the bat, I'm not a psychologist, right? But I've gone to see psychologists myself. So that's probably the piece I left out when I was going through the very difficult time. Apart from realizing I needed to make more money, I did have the realization that I was going to be raising a child by myself. I needed to sort my head out because I was emotionally broken by that relationship. So it's very important to go seek the help that you need. And for midlife women, even through menopause, I saw a psychiatrist, right? Because when menopause came for me, at that stage, my career is thriving. I've sorted a lot of all the past things out. My daughter's in teenage years or late teenage years, and I'm a fairly confident woman then. But then menopause comes and starts to upend my life. I'm not sleeping. I'm suffering from severe insomnia, severe anxiety, really bad hot flashes that made me feel nauseous all the time. So there's all this impact, brain fog, all of it. And it eroded my confidence. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, I recognize, hang on a minute, I've been down this road in the past. And so I put myself into a psychiatrist's office, and there's no shame in that. I think it's important to recognize, especially if your confidence is dented. And sometimes you may not need to go to a psychologist. Sometimes you might need to go and talk to someone in employee assistance programs if they have it going at their place of work. Or even, because look, most of us career coaches, we have been through something or we've put ourselves through some training. I've done both, right? Leadership programs, how to uplift myself, how to uplift other people. But I'm not a trained psychologist. And so I will always say to people, if you need more help than what I can give, you need to go get that. You need to get stable in your emotions, confident in your mental health and well-being again. So that's very important. It's a very important step to take. And then back to the professional story side of it, I have a process. It's actually on my website. It's a free resource, and I call it Mining Your Story. And mining your story, that whole exercise is all about someone going through the patterns of their life, because I feel, and I did notice when I was doing it for myself, there was a thread running through my life that told me, first of all, I had the ability to overcome because I've been through a lot, grew up in South Africa in apartheid through very violent times, had numerous things happen to me in my life. And I realized I had the ability to overcome. So I knew that there was that resilience factor in me. And so that was one thing I could identify about myself and leadership and resilience that I could offer a company. But then the other thing was, what was the other thread was writing. I had a way with words. I could articulate things and help people create stories and all of these things. So I was like, okay, there's another little threat. Now I need to explore that. And this is what I do with people. When the very first thing I do with people that I work with is we need to go and mine your story for your gold nuggets of who you are and what you can offer. And so many people I've seen don't know that. They do certain things automatically, right? Mm. And so for them, it's just an automatic skill, and they don't recognize that other companies might pay big bucks for it, that type of skill. And so often it's about mining the story, and then it comes down to framing the story in a way that's going to land with the person that's the hiring person.
So right? It's really a matter of communication, though, is what you're saying.
Absolute good communication. It comes back to that. Everything comes back to that.
And I find that interesting because when I've looked at or applied for big organizations, so let's talk, trying to think of one, but I'm just trying to think of a very generic process, and they force you to put in all your details. What's your career, what was your job timeline, stuff like that. And it seems like a lot of large organizations get stuck on this kind of timeline thing, right? Where they're looking for, which is actually conversely to what you're talking about, I think. Is that right? In terms of you're actually saying no one really cares about your timeline. What they really care about is the outcomes and how they might actually benefit the company which you're looking at. Is that correct?
Well, that's certainly what I've seen. I've seen that if you're good and you're able to articulate really clearly more of the outcomes and the results that you deliver, people tend to focus on that a lot more. One thing that has changed in the market in the last few years that I've noticed from the clients I work with and also the recruiters I work with and the corporations that I still work with is that they are hiring for emotional intelligence. That is very, very important. In the past, it used to be very focused on job-specific skills, right? Yeah. Now you have to be able to offer and demonstrate some of your EQ skills. Right. So we're talking, how do you work with people, your level of self-awareness? Are you a servant leader? Are you a dictator? What type of manager are you? All this type of thing is really important. And those behavioral questions, you're going to get more of those in the current job market than you will job-specific questions. Like I've only seen companies ask 2 or 3 role-specific or job-specific questions. A lot of the questions is all around behavior because they're trying to determine your EQ skills, right? Yep. That has become huge. And that's probably only happened in the last, I would say, 4 to 5 years, particularly also since the pandemic, right? They're looking for leaders now because some people who have gone back to the offices or even doing hybrid roles, some people are still shell-shocked from those isolation. That had quite significant psychological effects on people. And leaders in companies are beginning to they recognized that probably 2 years ago. And so they're looking for people that can help them lead their people through those difficulties that occurred during that time. And so you need to be a strong leader. You need to have the EQ and the IQ skills. So the job IQ skills, but the EQ skills.
And EQ, I think these days has got to be off the charts, given, especially if you're working in a hybrid context, because you've got to be picking up on cues where, when cameras are off, when mute buttons are on.
Yeah. And you have to
figure out how's your team member going, right? Or what are they saying between the lines? It's 3 weeks in a row I haven't seen the camera. That's interesting. And it's hard. You don't want to call someone out. Hey, Bob, turn your camera on, right? We haven't seen you. That doesn't particularly can work, but it certainly maybe doesn't leave Bob feeling too great. So it's a real sensitivity, right? In terms of, as you say, leadership in this context. Just to stick to the kind of the job processing, I'm curious because if you think about, I've been on the other side when you mentioned this, is that when you're hiring someone, and let's say you've stuck it up on Seek or some other job platform, the actual kind of recruit person or person in hiring they're getting very minimal information on that Seek preview, right? They're getting maybe a name, they're getting a previous role, and they're getting maybe one line, and that's about it. And whether they've, there's a cover letter or there's something else. There ain't too much to go off. And then, as you say, there's like hundreds of them. Right?
Yes.
And I've noticed, it's so easy to trip into like bias. Like you're going to look often, you're getting a lot of people from usually overseas also applying who are looking for roles. I'm not sure if it's particularly like in technical industries, but I know when I was looking in marketing roles, a lot of people looking to relocate from other countries. So you're just going sometimes off like a westernized Aussie sounding name, and that can be hugely biased, hugely like inaccurate, but there's not much else to go on. So I'm curious, how do you advise people to navigate that process? Because how do you even stand out in that domain?
Well, at the end of the day, it does always come back to that achievements focus that I mentioned, because yes, they have, and I've worked with clients where, they come from Middle Eastern countries, they come from Asian countries, and they do have the name that can cause the bias. And so those clients in particular, because a lot of them have got a lot of achievements. They're working in places like India where the technology is off the charts, right?
Absolutely.
And so we end up zoning in on that in particular. And I say to them, you need to be conscious of the bias. I was conscious of the bias towards me when I started, very, very much so, because I was, at that time, that industry was very male dominated. And so a lot of the time, especially when I landed in those first senior roles in corporate, only woman of color.
Yeah, right.
And so I'm aware of that bias. But what I've always seen happen, and this is what I've seen happen consistently, when you can demonstrate your ability to deliver and your achievements, at the end of the day, anything that's going to impact the bottom line is always going to sell. It's always going to stand out. And so you've got to become very good at articulating that. And that was what I learned, was that I had to focus on the leadership roles that I'd held prior to these when I was going into corporate IT. So I had been in the bank and so on. But I had held some team leadership roles. And so I zoned in on that, where I'd uplifted people, where I'd introduced new processes and procedures that affected the bottom line, that affected the delivery. And I noticed the moment I zoned in on that was when I started landing the interviews and when I got the job offer. Because at the end of the day, the decision makers care about that more than anything, right? They care about how you bring the people skills, the delivery skills, and how it's going to affect their revenue generation or their upliftment in processes that's going to make things better, faster, more efficient, and so on and so on. Yeah. And so you always need to put yourself in the mind of the final hiring person. That's why, because a lot of people I do see people be a little bit careless with their resumes and their profiles when they have a recruiter, because what they think is that the recruiter is going to uplift that. And it doesn't. Recruiters don't have time anymore.
They
just buzz it through. And so, and in my day, I will say we had recruiters helping us. Like I told you, I picked their brains, but also when I started landing my contracts, the recruiters were only getting 15 job applications back then. So they took the time to sit with you and say, no, you could word this better, you could do this. Yeah. That doesn't happen anymore now. So you need to be the person that creates a different level of communication that makes you stand out. At the end of the day, you need to not be a run-of-the-mill candidate. You need to not be writing your resumes and your profile like everyone else does it. You have got to be different.
Let's talk about interviewing. So let's say you've nailed your resume. You've somehow got through the bias, the technology trickiness, and you're there. How are you navigating that? What's the kind of the hot tips? Maybe let's start with the inverse. What's the most common thing that you see in interviews that most people are getting wrong, which kind of like just shoots yourself in the foot?
Waffle, talking too long. So my training with the people that I work with, when we go through the interview prep coaching, I go, okay, give me your answer, ask them the question. I don't interrupt on the first session. The first one is I want to get a feel for how they actually respond. And there has not been one person who speaks 2 minutes or less. They are talking up to 3 minutes, up to 4 minutes, up to 5 minutes. That is too long. And here's why. First of all, an interviewer is going to have their set of questions prepared, probably between 10 and 15 questions. You're going to get about 45 minutes or an hour, not more than that. they don't have the time, so they're going to at most give you an hour. If you're talking too long on every answer, you are going to chew into the questions that might be the most important questions, which they might have listed at the bottom of their list, which could be questions about how is this person going to fit into the program culture or into the company culture. So you've chewed up the time. They end up closing off the interview. They haven't got that final clear picture about you. But if you're the candidate that speaks succinctly, that can answer a question in, say, no more than 2.5 minutes or less, you're going to have an opportunity, or the interview is going to have the opportunity to ask all their questions. So they're going to get the whole feel of you. They're going to ask their job-specific questions. They're going to ask their behavioral questions, and they're going to ask their culture fit questions. They've got a much bigger picture of you and how you're going to fit into their team and into their company. You have a better chance of landing the job. And what people get wrong, and I've seen it over and over and over again, even when I was interviewing, and I interviewed for 15 years, 16 years, waffle too long. They want to tell their whole life story. All right.
And it's nerves too, right? It's the worst.
It's
like if you try to make a good impression, you're nervous and you just start talking. It's just elongated, lack of structure, and not focused on the audience from what was basically what you're saying.
Absolutely, yeah. And look, interviewers expect you to be nervous. They know people are going to be a little bit nervous. They can usually even tell, but when you first start talking, there's a little bit of the shakes in the voice and all of that. But they do expect you to get your stride about a quarter way through, right? They do expect you to start going, okay, this is not so bad. The world hasn't fallen down over me while I'm sitting here. So they expect you to hit your stride usually just after the quarter mark through the interview. And if you're not hitting your stride and you're still waffling and you're not answering the question, this is another thing I see people getting wrong. What I see people doing when they're really nervous is they don't listen to the full question. So as soon as the interview starts asking, they think the interviewer means this and they start answering this, but there's a tail end of the question that the interviewer hasn't yet finished. Okay, now you've just answered the question completely incorrect because you didn't let that person finish what they actually wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
So a tip that I can give is clarify the question. Like if you're so nervous that you think, I didn't quite get that, just say something like, for the interest of clarity, would you mind just repeating that question again and then listen? Because two things will happen. One is obviously you get the question reiterated to you, but also you buy yourself a few seconds, a few moments to just, crystallize your thoughts. And so those are the two things I see, the waffle and the not listening. And it happens when you're nervous. And that's why practice is really important. People need to practice. And if you're not practicing with a coach, sit down with your partner, with a colleague, talk to the dog if you have to film. I get some of my clients to film themselves. When they have to do the homework, I'm like, okay, now, you've got the questions. So now you need to go and film yourself answering these questions because you get to time yourself as well. On a phone, you get to time yourself. So oh gosh, that was like 5-minute answer. I need to trim that back, The
bit when they go, so have you got any questions for us? What do you reckon's your best take on that? Like how should you navigate that bit where it kind of almost flips gears so it becomes less of the interrogation and now it's almost like sometimes it sounds like a bit of a throwaway comment, but what's your kind of best take on that? How would you navigate that piece?
Well, that's there again is a tip around the timing, because if you talk too long, then you never get to that part of the interview, right? Because they always, all of them do it. They say, do you have any questions for us? And I always say to my clients, make sure you've got 1 or 2 questions prepared. And some of the good ones could be something like you say directly to the interviewer. So because you want to have done your research. So if you've done your research, you'll probably know that your interview's been at the company for a few years, right? Or 2 years or 3 years or whatever. And you say to them, I noticed from you. So here's where you can let them know you've done a bit of research, in a subtle way. I see that you've been with the company for 5 years. What is the best thing about working for this company? And the reason that's a good question is because you're going to get insight into how they're thinking, but also they're going to reveal some of the culture fit of the company. Because here's the thing, you need to remember, they're not only interviewing you, you interviewing them. If you're going for your dream job, then things need to line up mutually, right? You need to be working for a company where, and another question, which is also a good one, is how does work-life balance look at this company? What do you do to support, or if you, a midlife woman, say, well, midlife women, we go through these changes, what is in place to support that? If you're going to get your answers very quickly about whether that company is, because a dream company or a company is not a dream company if it's not meeting some of your most fundamental needs. Because people think a dream company sometimes is about, I'm going to earn $250,000 a year or whatever, right? And they only look at it from a monetary standpoint.
Yeah.
But you could end up earning that money in so many challenging ways, right? So if you don't have the support with the family life, you don't have the support with certain stages of life, like for women, midlife, then it is going to become a challenge. And no amount of money is going to stop the impact on your health, on your relationships, on all of those things. And so you have to direct that as much as it's never just an interrogation situation. It is supposed to be a mutually, exploration. Is this company the right fit for me? Am I the right fit for the company?
Tricky to navigate that though, right? Especially depending on when you're interviewing, because I know that's the ideal scenario what you're talking about, where quote unquote it's a conversation of equals. But I guess often if you're relying on the income, you really need the money. You need the $20,000. If you're not careful, you can quickly feel like there's an imbalance in that conversation, and it becomes almost like you're just pleading for the role if you're not careful, right? So I'm curious in terms of timing, how often or what kind of lag time, or forgive me, the opposite, kind of a preparation time, as it were, is required, do you think, to really give yourself the best chance of success if you are going to go down that route of chasing your dream job? Because it sounds like you need to be in a position where you actually can negotiate from strength rather than one of, oh God, I really hope they give me this job because I don't know how I'm going to pay the mortgage next week, right?
Yeah, that's right. So look, and that's why the best time to be hunting for the dream job is when you currently have a job. The worst time is when you don't have a job. Because you do come,
for sure.
You cannot come from a position of strength when it comes to negotiation when you worried about school fees, bills, money, any of that. You're never going to be able to do that. And so a lot of the people I work with people that are already that are in their current jobs, and they're starting to explore. They're going, you know what, this doesn't feel like the right place for me anymore. I've done 5 years. There isn't a lot of opportunity for growth, and so on and so on. I never encourage people to leave a job, ever. You need to have your finances worked out. And sometimes, I think it was The Great Debaters. It's a movie, and it says something like, sometimes you have to do what you don't want to do in order to be able to do what you want to do eventually, right? And I've always had that slogan in my mind, and even back then in those days. So that's why I worked the 3 jobs, being the Reiki person, being the coaching people through their career, and working, my then corporate job, but I wanted the bigger corporate job, because I knew that I would put myself under incredible financial stress, and I already was trying to chase a dream job without any money or no income coming in.
Yep.
And so the best time to go for a dream job is when you're in your current job, not when you are jobless. Then you need to go for I call it a transitional role. And the transitional role is probably going to be more of the same. So if you're a project manager and you've worked at the telco and you're now going for a project manager role at the bank, likely to be more of the same, may not be the dream role, but you go for it and you take it and it becomes your transitional role. And as soon as you land in that company, you need to start planning your career goals, your career map. This is what I ultimately want. And I'm going to do it alongside working this job while I'm bringing in steady income and getting myself upskilled, up-leveled in negotiation, better at interviews, because it is difficult, almost near impossible, to land the one that you really want when you are stressed out over money. I've not seen it work. I've not seen it work.
Some universal wisdom there. I feel like, it's when's the best time to dig the well is not when you're thirsty, right? And
correct.
I think that's, it's kind
absolutely.
of in whatever area of expertise you're in. I feel like that's being proactive rarely bites you in the ass. It's often kind of helps you get ahead, helps you face up and have the teams. Sometimes it can be costly, perhaps, when people are in that I'm not sure if I want to leave stage, then maybe it can kind of feel a little bit like, the cart before the horse. But if in terms of what you're talking about, I think lead time is the phrase which escaped me just before in that question. That lead time is really, really important, right? In terms of allowing people to figure it out and come from a place of strength. And I guess there's also the opportunity to discover what they don't know about how they come across, perhaps, and how long, shaping those career, what do you call it? The professional stories, and how you own that, that time to actually sculpt those or put those together. And maybe you don't have adequate ones, because I guess maybe that's the question to kind of close the conversation on. What if you've had a massive career bump? Maybe COVID was really hard and you actually had to drop out and you pretty much sucked at the last job. Or you're a sales, I could certainly speak for myself here, like, COVID was really tricky and there's certain sales roles didn't go well, and it's kind of like you're trying to move from what hasn't been great success to something where you're trying to position yourself as, this incredible person who can, deliver for the next company. How do you navigate that trickiness where, not everything does go right in business? You don't always have success is not a straight line.
No, it's not. It's not a straight line. But I think everyone's got success stories. And sometimes you may have to reference the personal stories for that, right? And I'll give you an example. I had, and I always share this example because it impressed me so much. I was interviewing someone on a role, and he got so nervous. I asked the question about something around achievement, and he was stumbling. And then he just paused in the middle of that. And it was all about how he uplifted a team. That was the question. Tell me about when you uplifted a team. And he couldn't think of a professional example. And he switched to the soccer team, the Suns soccer team, that the team was at the bottom of the ladder, the action steps he took to uplift the soccer team, and they ended up winning the championship, the premiership that year, right? And I ended up giving the guy the job because he could pivot on his feet. And he didn't simply reference his professional story. And this is what I want people to remember, is that there are successes in our personal stories as well, and they matter just as much. If you are someone who has overcome a severe injury, for example, or if you are someone who's been out of work for 2 or 3 years and then you've done X, Y, and Z, you've upskilled yourself, you've gone and volunteered at a company to gain the skills that you need. All of those stories matter. So the mining your story process that I do is not just about people's professional stories. It's about pulling the stories from the various sources of our life so that we have them ready. Now, some of them we're going to use on our resume and on our LinkedIn. Some of them we're going to use in an interview when we stumble and we can't think of the professional one. We go, oh my God, I'm drawing a blank, but you can quickly come up with a personal one. And so that's why it's so important to know and own your professional story. Because if you don't, or you have challenges owning your own successes, right, no one else is ever going to be convinced.
It's a great way to put it. What a powerful place to leave this conversation. Wendy Alexander, thank you so much for taking the time out to chat to us. Your website, happycareerhub.com. We're going to link to that in the description below. And where can people find you if they want to kind of continue this conversation, when they want to reach out to you?
So LinkedIn is probably the best place because I'm very active on LinkedIn. I put a lot of free information up there, and my handle is Wendy A. Alexander. So I had to use the A because Wendy Alexander was taken. So it's Wendy A. Alexander on LinkedIn, and then happycareerhub.com.
He's a bit like Wendy. Help me!
That's right.
I need
That's
to get
right.
a job, something like that.
That's right.
Very good, Wendy. I like that's really powerful. Like Wendy, you've shared some really interesting stuff here. I think it's so easy when we're applying for a job to kind of fit into kind of, I need this, I want this, and we miss stopping to think about, okay, cool, what did that company want? Right? What's the key thing? And then how do I speak into that? And how do I best portray myself into that person in the way that they want to consume it? And I think it's very powerful having someone like yourself help people navigate that process, because I often feel the recruitment process is so stacked in favor of the company.
Yes.
You meet in their office, you meet with their people, there's usually multiple of people of them, and there's one of you. And, like all of that is kind of like, quote unquote, could be intimidating, whereas bringing in someone like yourself is kind of like being an advocate, right? Kind of leveling the playing field somewhat to make sure that you've got the team behind you to deliver on what you're trying to achieve. So, yeah, Wendy, thanks so much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, you too. Wonderful to speak with you, Michael.